I have lived in this house for 43 years, long enough to memorize every creak in the floorboards and the way the light shifts across the wallpaper as afternoon gives way to dusk. It used to be a place of noise and purpose. The piano in the front room was always open, its keys smudged by small, curious fingers. My children would gather around while Amos tapped out lullabies, and I would pretend to scold them for crowding him so close. Those days slipped by faster than I realized. Now, most mornings, I rise before dawn to tidy the kitchen, polish the old brass handles, and water the rosemary Amos planted along the back fence. Sometimes I catch myself expecting his voice, that low hum of a song he never finished. But the silence always corrects me. Lately, the silence has grown heavier. My children, Stellan and Marble, have been stopping by more often, never together. Always in brief, courteous visits that leave a chill in their wake. They pretend it's about checking on me, asking if I need anything, but their eyes wander. They rest on the framed photographs, the drawer by the sideboard, the locked cabinet where I keep my documents. Last Tuesday, Stellan leaned against the kitchen counter, swirling the last of his coffee, and asked in that too casual tone whether I'd spoken to anyone about my will. He tried to soften it with a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Marbell came by 2 days later with a basket of muffins she hadn't baked herself. She patted my hand as if I were a fussy child, and murmured about how much easier it would be for me if they helped manage things. I nodded because it was simpler than contradicting her, but inside a small defiance flickered. I have managed my own life longer than either of them has been alive. That evening, when the house was quiet again, I locked the bedroom door and counted the folders in the safe, just to be sure nothing had already slipped away without me noticing. On the morning of my 68th birthday, I woke before the sun rose above the water and sat for a long time at the kitchen table, listening to the hush of the house. I set out my mother's porcelain teacups in neat rows, folded the linen napkins, and baked a lemon butter cake, even though I suspected no one would come to share it. Still, I needed to believe that maybe this year would be different. By late morning, I had carried the cake to the dining room and set 3 places. The candles flickered in the draft, reminding me how easily even a steady flame can be snuffed out. I kept glancing at the clock, each hour stretching longer than the last. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Leora finally appeared, her hair still tied up in her school ribbon, her backpack sagging from one shoulder. She didn't look up from her phone as she walked in. I tried to smooth the ache in my chest, telling myself at least she was here. "Mom's working late," she said, scrolling with her thumb. "Uncle Stellan had some appointment." I pressed a slice of cake into her hand. She took it without tasting it, her gaze never lifting. I poured tea for us both and asked how school was going. She shrugged, tapping out a reply to someone I couldn't see. After a moment, she set her phone down and looked at me, her expression caught between curiosity and something else I didn't want to name. "Grandma," she began, her voice too soft, "do you have, a lot of money in your accounts?" I tried not to let my face change, but I could feel the cold surprise rooting me to the chair. "Why would you ask that?" I managed. She shrugged again, embarrassed. "Mom said, never mind." When she left, the house felt emptier than it had all day. I carried the untouched cake back into the kitchen, set it carefully on the counter, and rested my hand on the tin of important papers. My fingers trembled as I traced the edges, wondering what else they were already planning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the old radiator ticking and the wind tapping against the window. My thoughts circled back to Leora's question, to the way she couldn't quite meet my eyes. It lodged under my ribs like a splinter. Sometime after midnight, I rose and pulled on my robe. The house was still, the kind of quiet that feels watchful. I stood in the hallway trying to remember when exactly I had stopped feeling safe inside these walls. I was about to turn back to my room when I heard the faintest sound from the front entry, just the scrape of the drawer being opened. My breath caught. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, some trick of an anxious mind. But then I saw her small figure crouched by the sideboard, the pale glow of her phone lighting her face. "Leora," I said, my voice low but steadier than I felt. She startled so violently she nearly dropped the phone. When she looked up, her cheeks were wet, and her mouth worked soundlessly before words finally tumbled out. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I wasn't going to take anything. I had to see you." I moved closer, feeling the chill of the floor seep into my bones. "What is it, sweetheart?" Her hands twisted in the hem of her cardigan. They were talking, Mom and Uncle Stellan. After dinner they said, Tomorrow at noon, they're going to take you to the bank. They said if you got upset, they'd tell you it was for your own good, that you'd sign the forms because you're forgetful." I sank down onto the bench beside her, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might drown out her voice. "They don't think you'd remember," she added, her voice breaking. "But I heard them. I thought you should know." I reached out and drew her into my arms. For a moment, I let myself tremble. When I pulled back, I smoothed her hair and felt a new clarity settle inside me, a quiet resolve I hadn't felt in years. After Leora slipped out into the night, I sat for a long time in the quiet entryway, my hand resting on the drawer she had left ajar, the darkness pressed around me. But I no longer felt afraid of it. There was something almost comforting in the hush, as if the house itself were holding its breath with me. When the clock chimed midnight, I stood. My legs felt unsteady, but my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. I crossed the living room to the piano and sank onto the bench. My hands hovered over the keys, remembering all the nights Amos and I had sat here side by side, playing until the children fell asleep. With a deep breath, I lifted the cushion and reached into the hollow beneath it. My fingers brushed the cool metal of the lockbox. I hadn't opened it since Amos tucked it there, saying it was safer to keep some things close but hidden. I drew it out and set it on the piano lid. The key was still on my ring. My hand didn't shake as I turned it. Inside were the documents I had always known I would need someday: bank records, insurance papers, the deed to the house. I closed the box and carried it to the kitchen table. At dawn, I brewed coffee and called Celine Chapin. The line rang twice before she picked up. "Lisa," she said, sounding startled, "is everything all right?" "I need to update my will," I told her, "and I want all my accounts moved into a trust that no one else can touch." She hesitated, and for a moment I imagined she might protest, but then she simply said, "I can come by this afternoon." I thanked her and hung up. The first light of morning slipped across the floor, illuminating the bouquet of wilted birthday flowers on the counter. I gathered them gently and carried them out to the trash, feeling the weight in my chest lighten as I let them go. It was just afternoon when Stellan's car pulled into the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as he climbed out, smoothing his jacket like he was preparing for a performance. Marble followed behind him, carrying a casserole dish wrapped in a tea towel, as though they were only here for a pleasant afternoon visit. I waited by the dining table, the lockbox resting in plain sight. When they knocked, I called for them to come in. Stellan's smile was too bright as he stepped into the room. "Mom," he began, his tone syrupy, "we thought it would be nice to bring you lunch." Marbelle set the casserole on the counter. Her gaze drifted to the lockbox before she quickly looked away. "You've been on our minds," she said. "We just want to make sure you're comfortable." I folded my hands together. "I'm quite comfortable." Stellan cleared his throat. "About the bank, Mom, we thought it would be best to take care of everything today, just to be safe. You know, with you not feeling your best lately," Marble chimed in, her voice soft, "it's really about protecting you, so you don't have to worry about bills or paperwork." I studied them both. I remembered the children they once were. Stellan begging me to sing when the thunder scared him. Marble shyly asking me to braid her hair. I wondered how those memories could sit beside this moment without shattering. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice even, "but I've already spoken to Celine. My accounts are in a trust now. No one else will be managing them." The silence that followed stretched long enough for the kitchen clock to tick out 5 beats. Stellan's mouth opened, then closed. "Mom," he said finally, "you don't need to make this harder than it has to be." "I'm not," I replied. "I'm simply telling you the truth." Marble looked down at her hands. Stellan's jaw tightened. I reached for the lockbox and closed the lid with a soft click, feeling something inside me settle into place as I met their eyes. After they left, I carried the casserole to the counter and set it aside without unwrapping it. My appetite had slipped away the moment I saw the pity in Marbelle's eyes, the irritation in Stellan's. I sat at the piano bench and rested my hands in my lap, feeling the quiet wrap around me like an old quilt. I let my gaze drift to the photograph on the mantel, the one of Amos holding Leora the day she was born. He looked so proud, his eyes crinkled in that way they did whenever he felt completely at peace. I pressed my palm to the picture frame and let my memories loosen from the corners of my mind. I thought of the first time he brought me to this house. It was nothing but dusty rooms and creaking floors then, but he had walked me from one space to the next, describing what it would become. "You deserve something beautiful," he had said, his hand warm against my back. "And you deserve to know it's yours." He'd been the one to insist I keep an account in my own name, money I could use if I ever needed to stand on my own. At the time, I'd thought it was a gesture I'd never have to lean on. I had believed so firmly that the children we raised would protect what we built together. I traced the keys of the piano with my fingertips, remembering the song Amos used to hum when he thought I wasn't listening. It rose in my mind clear as any recording, and I let it fill the room. The tears came then, sliding down my cheeks in slow, unstoppable lines. But they didn't hollow me out the way I expected. If anything, they made something inside me solidify, a conviction that felt almost like relief. When the last note faded, I rose and returned to the kitchen, where the lockbox still waited on the table. My hands were steady as I picked it up and carried it to the small safe behind the pantry shelves, closing it away where no one else would find it. I didn't go to bed that night. Instead, I made coffee and sat in the darkened dining room, the kitchen lamp switched off so the windows reflected nothing but my own outline. I thought about the way Stellan's voice had gone tight with disappointment, the way Marble's hands had trembled as she adjusted her purse. The hours slipped past with the slow certainty of a tide. At some point, I must have drifted into a shallow doze, because the next thing I knew, the clock on the stove glowed 2:30 a.m., and the kitchen door creaked open. I didn't move. I kept my breathing even, my eyes lowered just enough to see the shadow pass across the threshold. Stellan's shape resolved itself in the faint glow of the porch light behind him. He stood still for a moment, listening, before stepping fully inside. He didn't call my name. He didn't announce himself. He went straight to the cabinet by the pantry, the one he must have convinced himself held the lockbox. My hand closed around Amos's cane, the smooth wood reassuring against my palm. Stellan eased the cabinet door open. I saw his shoulders tense when he found nothing inside. He turned, scanning the room. For a heartbeat, I almost pitied him, the desperation clinging to him like a second skin. Then I reached across the table and clicked on the lamp. His head snapped up, his mouth falling open. "Looking for something?" I asked. My voice came out calm, as though we were discussing the weather. He swallowed hard, color rising in his face. "Mom, I thought I heard something." I watched him unblinking. "At 2:30 in the morning?" He tried to smile, but it twisted into something brittle. "You know how old houses are. Doors don't always stay shut." I didn't answer. I only shifted the cane across my lap and let the silence expand between us. In that moment, I could see exactly how afraid he was that I might no longer be as pliable as he'd hoped. Stellan stood frozen, one hand still resting on the empty cabinet door. I could see the calculation flicker behind his eyes as he weighed whether to keep pretending. His mouth opened, but no words came. I lifted my phone from the table and turned the screen toward him. The call timer glowed bright and undeniable. "Celine is listening," I said, my voice so level it startled even me. I thought it best to have someone hear this conversation. He flinched like I'd struck him. "Mom, you don't understand." "No," I interrupted. "You don't understand. This is my house. That money is mine, and you will never again set foot in here uninvited." His jaw tightened. "You're overreacting," he said, but the fight was already draining out of him. "I was only trying to help." "Help!" I let the word hang between us. Coming into my kitchen in the middle of the night, opening my cabinets, that isn't help. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, searching for some foothold he couldn't find. "I don't want things to be ugly," he said finally, his voice low. "Then you should have thought of that before you started plotting behind my back." He swallowed again, his throat working. I wondered if he remembered the first time I put a bandage on his scraped knee, or the nights he cried after his father left, and how I'd held him until he slept. I wondered if any of it mattered anymore. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for years. "You need to leave now," I said quietly, "and don't come back without calling first." He hesitated, his shoulders slumping, then turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded too final to be undone. I stayed at the table until the headlights faded from the driveway. My hands were steady as I turned off the lamp and carried my phone to the front hall, where I set it gently on the side table next to Amos's framed photograph. The days after Stellan left passed in a hush so deep it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. I waited for the phone to ring, for Marbell to come tapping at the door with apologies rehearsed and ready, but no one came. No messages arrived. I swept the kitchen every morning, made my coffee, watered Amos's rosemary by the back fence. The routines grounded me, steady as a metronome. Some afternoons I caught myself listening for footsteps on the porch, half hoping and half dreading they might appear again to plead their case. But the silence stretched on, and I began to understand it was not temporary. I think part of me had always known this moment was waiting, tucked in the spaces between all their careful questions and two sweet smiles. It was Leora who finally broke the stillness. One Thursday after school, she came up the walk alone, her backpack slipping off one shoulder. I opened the door before she could knock. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and unsteady, and for a second she was the little girl who used to crawl into my lap with a storybook and ask me to read until she fell asleep. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know they'd really do it." I reached for her hand, surprised by how small it felt in mine. "You were brave to tell me," I said, and meant it with all my heart. She nodded, blinking fast. "Mom says you're mad, that you don't want to see them anymore." I didn't answer right away. The words felt too heavy to lift. Instead, I led her into the kitchen and poured her a glass of milk, the same way I used to when she was little. She sipped it in silence while I set a plate of butter cookies between us. When she finally looked up again, there was something steadier in her gaze, as if she was trying to understand why everything had changed. I rested my palm on the table, feeling the old wood warm under my skin, and drew in a quiet breath. Spring came early to the coast that year. One morning, I woke to find the hyacinths budding along the walkway, pale blue and violet against the damp earth. I stood by the window with my coffee, feeling something in my chest ease in a way I hadn't thought possible. After so many years of giving everything I had, it startled me to discover how much was left. When I finally stopped offering pieces of myself to people who only measured my worth in what I could hand over, I began to fill my days with small things that had nothing to do with them. I joined the piano circle at the library, where I met neighbors who knew nothing about my children or my accounts. On Wednesday mornings, I taught a few beginners how to find middle C and feel the weight of the keys under their palms. Their questions were simple, honest, unclouded by expectation. In the afternoons, I tended the flower beds Amos and I had planted when the children were small. I thinned the weeds, coaxed the new shoots, and felt my shoulders grow lighter every time I turned the soil. One evening, Leora came by again, this time with a paper bag of sweet rolls she'd saved from her lunch. She hovered in the doorway until I waved her in. She watched me pour tea, her expression cautious. "Grandma," she said after a long pause, "you look different." I set the teapot down and turned to face her. "How so?" "You look like you're happy," she whispered. I touched her cheek with my thumb, brushing away a stray crumb. "I think I am," I said. It surprised me how true it felt. I had thought the best parts of my life were behind me, that all I had left was to endure whatever they decided I should be. But standing there in my own kitchen, I knew I had chosen something else. I had chosen to belong to myself. The weeks stretched into months. I learned how to let the quiet be company instead of punishment. Sometimes I walked to the shore at dawn and stood barefoot in the sand, watching the tide draw lines across the beach only to erase them again. The rhythm comforted me, the way the sea always returned, no matter how many times it was pulled away. One afternoon, I found myself in the attic, sorting through boxes that had been untouched for decades. Among the brittle photo albums and yellowed letters, I discovered the quilt Amos's mother had stitched by hand, each square a patch of fabric from clothing long outgrown. I carried it downstairs and spread it across the bed, marveling at how strong the stitches still held. It felt like a reminder that some things endure even when you think they've frayed beyond saving. Leora visited often that summer. Sometimes she came with questions about school, sometimes just to sit at the piano while I played. She listened more than she spoke, her head tilted as if she was trying to memorize the way my hands moved across the keys. Once she asked if I would teach her the same lullabies Amos used to play. I agreed, and as her small fingers fumbled over the notes, I felt something inside me mend. Not long after, Marbell appeared at the door. She stood on the porch, her face drawn and tired, holding a Tupperware container of soup. "Lisa," she said quietly, "I wanted to bring you something." I took the container but said nothing. She shifted from foot to foot, her eyes darting toward the kitchen where Leora sat at the table. "I miss her spending time with you," Marbell admitted. "I didn't mean for things to get so bad." I looked at my daughter, at the woman she'd become, and I searched for the girl who once pressed daisies into my hand. But all I could see was the distance she had chosen to put between us. "You should go," I told her, my voice steady. She nodded, her lips pressed tight, and left without another word. That night I sat by the window long after dark, the soup untouched on the counter. I thought about forgiveness, about whether it was something owed or something earned. I wondered if it was possible to love your children and still protect yourself from them. The answer, I decided, was yes. By autumn, the rosemary along the back fence had grown wild, its stems pushing through the slats like they were reaching for freedom. I trimmed them back carefully, bundling sprigs to hang in the kitchen. The scent filled the air, sharp and clean, reminding me of Amos's hands in the dirt, his laughter carried on the wind. One crisp morning, Leora arrived with a notebook tucked under her arm. She opened it on the table, revealing pages filled with questions she'd written in careful script. "Grandma," she said, "can you tell me stories about when you were little? About Mom and Uncle Stellwinter came heavy that year, laying frost across the windows until the glass turned opaque with cold. I moved through the house in thick sweaters, the piano keys cool beneath my fingers when I played in the evenings. The quiet no longer pressed down on me the way it once had. It felt more like a companion now, a reminder that peace could take root in even the most battered soil." One night, as the snow fell in heavy sheets, I sat at the kitchen table writing letters. Not to Stellan or Marbell, I had nothing left to say to them, but to Leora. I told her stories I hadn't shared aloud, about her grandfather's stubborn streak, about the way he once painted the back fence 3 different times because he couldn't get the shade of green quite right. I sealed the envelopes carefully, tucking them into the lockbox with the other documents. One day, when she was ready, she would find them. The next morning, I woke to the crunch of tires in the driveway. Through the frost-laced window, I saw Stellan standing in the cold, his shoulders hunched, his breath clouding in the air. He didn't knock. He just stood there for a long time, staring at the front door as though daring it to open. When he finally turned and walked back to his car, I let the curtain fall and sat down with my tea. My heart ached, but not in the way it once did. It was the ache of acceptance, of knowing some wounds remain, no matter how much you wish them closed. Leora arrived later that week, her cheeks red from the cold, her backpack stuffed with books. She flopped onto the couch and sighed, the sound too weary for someone her age. "Grandma," she said, "do you ever feel like no one listens to you, like you're talking, but it's just air?" I set my knitting aside and joined her, smoothing her hair the way I used to when she was little. "All the time," I admitted. "But you know what I learned? The people who matter will hear you, even if it takes a while, and the ones who don't, maybe they were never meant to." She thought about that for a moment, her brow furrowed, then nodded. We spent the rest of the afternoon baking gingerbread, the house filling with a sweetness I hadn't felt in years. As the months slipped by, I found myself growing lighter, as though each day peeled away another layer of fear I hadn't realized I was carrying. I started attending Sunday services again, slipping into the back pew where no one expected me to play hostess or smile on command. I sang the hymns softly, my voice rusty but steady, and felt Amos's presence in the swell of the organ. It was there, in that quiet rhythm of faith, that I began to feel whole again. I walked home afterward with the winter sun low on the horizon, the air sharp in my lungs, and I realized I wasn't walking back to an empty house. I was walking back to mine. Leora spent much of that spring with me. Sometimes we planted herbs together, her laughter carrying across the yard. Sometimes we just sat in the living room, her homework spread across the coffee table while I read nearby. She filled the house with a warmth I thought I had lost forever. And in her presence, I discovered something I hadn't dared to hope for, joy that belonged to me, untouched by anyone else's hands. One afternoon, she handed me a folded piece of paper. "It's an essay for school," she said shyly. "We had to write about someone we admire." I opened it, my eyes blurring as I read her words. She had written about me, about my strength, my stubbornness, my piano playing, my way of finding light even when others tried to dim it. I held her close, unable to speak, my tears soaking into her hair. Summer came, golden and loud with cicadas. The house smelled of rosemary and lemon balm, the garden blooming with color. I played the piano with the windows open, letting the music drift into the warm air. Sometimes neighbors paused on their walks to listen, waving when they caught my eye. I waved back, feeling connected in a way I hadn't in years. Stellan and Marbell remained distant. There were no more surprise visits, no more forced smiles or casseroles left on the counter. I heard of them occasionally through whispers in town, Stellan arguing with a business partner, Marble seen at the market with a pinched look about her. But they never came to my door again. And though the knowledge stung, it also freed me. I had given them enough of my life, the rest belonged to me. On the anniversary of Amos's passing, I lit a candle by the piano and played his favorite hymn. The notes rose steady and sure, filling the room with something sacred. As I played, I felt him there beside me, his hand warm against my shoulder. For the first time, the memory didn't break me. It steadied me. That night, I wrote one last letter and placed it in the lockbox. Not for Leora, not for anyone else, but for myself. In it, I wrote the truth I had finally come to understand, that love is not proven by sacrifice alone, that family is not measured by blood but by kindness, and that belonging begins when you claim it for yourself. Years from now, when Leora opens that box, she will find not just documents and instructions, but a map of who I was, someone who refused to be erased, and maybe, just maybe, she will carry that strength forward. As autumn returned, the rosemary grew wild again, and I let it. Its stubborn branches pressed against the fence, filling the air with their sharp, clean scent. I stood in the yard with the evening sun painting the sky gold, and thought about everything I had endured. Betrayal, silence, loss, and still, I remained. When Leora asked me once what I wanted most now, I told her the truth. Peace, I said, and for the first time, I believed it was mine to keep. And when they were my age? I smiled, touched by the earnestness in her request, and began to share. I told her about the winters when the snow came up to the windowsills, about the summers when we camped by the river, about the day Amos proposed under the willow tree by the park. As I spoke, I realized I was giving her something no one could twist or take away. Our history, unvarnished and real. Her pen scratched across the page, capturing it all. And I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, through her, the best of us would survive.